You may have cooked the dinner, Margaret, but you won't be sitting at this table tonight, Emily Whitmore said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. And for a moment the entire dining room went quiet except for the soft clink of silverware being arranged on china plates that Margaret herself had owned for more than 30 years. Margaret Whitmore had turned 68 just 3 days earlier, and she had spent most of that week preparing for Thanksgiving, the way she always had. The house in Cedar Grove had hosted Thanksgiving dinners for decades, long before Emily ever entered the family. Margaret had roasted the turkey slowly for 4 hours, basted it every 30 minutes, and filled the kitchen with the warm scent of sage, butter, and roasted apples. The dining table stretched nearly 10 feet across the room, polished until it reflected the candlelight. She had laid out her best dishes, the same cream-colored china she and her late husband Thomas had bought during their first year of marriage. Every chair was carefully placed, every napkin folded just the way her mother had taught her. Margaret believed traditions mattered. They reminded people who they were and where they came from. By the time the family began arriving that afternoon, the house felt alive again. Her son Daniel walked in first, carrying a bottle of wine. Behind him came Emily, elegant as always, wearing a pale sweater and holding her phone as if she were documenting the evening for someone who wasn't there. Their daughter Olivia rushed inside next, the cold November air still clinging to her coat. Margaret hugged her granddaughter tightly. For a brief moment, everything felt exactly the way Thanksgiving should feel. Warm, familiar, safe. Margaret carried the last bowl of mashed potatoes to the table and glanced proudly at the dinner she had spent days preparing. The turkey sat in the center, golden brown and fragrant. Bowls of cranberry sauce and green beans surrounded it. Steam rose gently from the stuffing dish. The candles flickered softly along the middle of the table. It was perfect. Then Emily stepped forward holding several small white cards. "I made place cards this year," she said brightly, as if she were announcing a charming little surprise. She began placing them in front of each chair with careful precision. Daniel's seat, Olivia's seat, the guests' seats. Margaret watched politely from the side of the table, assuming her daughter-in-law was simply trying to help organize the dinner. But when Emily finished arranging the cards, Margaret noticed something strange. There was no card for her. Margaret glanced along the table again, slowly, just to be sure. 8 chairs. 8 cards. None of them said Margaret Whitmore. Emily noticed her looking and gave a small laugh, the kind people use when they want to soften something uncomfortable. "Oh, Margaret," she said gently, lowering her voice just enough for the nearby guests to hear. "We thought it would be easier if you sat near the kitchen tonight. That way you can bring things out when we need them." Margaret stood very still beside the table she had prepared with her own hands. The smell of turkey filled the room. The candles burned quietly. Her family slowly took their seats, and the chair at the head of the table remained empty. Margaret did not argue. She simply nodded once, the way people do when they decide that speaking will only make a moment worse. The kitchen light glowed softly behind her, while the dining room filled with the warm, golden light of candles. Emily slid into her chair beside Daniel as though she had always belonged there, as though she were the hostess of the house. Margaret picked up the bowl of gravy and carried it to the table. She placed it gently beside the turkey. No one met her eyes for more than a second. The conversation had already started, quick and casual, the way it does when people pretend nothing unusual has happened. Daniel began carving the turkey, carefully slicing the breast meat the way his father used to show him many years ago. Margaret noticed that detail immediately. For a brief second, she remembered Thomas standing in that exact place every Thanksgiving, wearing the same red apron, laughing as he argued with the oven timer. Those memories moved quietly through her mind like old photographs. Margaret returned to the kitchen and leaned lightly against the counter. From there she could see the entire dining room through the wide archway. 8 people sat around the long table she had polished that morning. The candles reflected in the china plates. Glasses clinked softly as wine was poured. The scent of roasted turkey drifted through the house. Margaret reached for a clean plate and filled it with a small serving of turkey, a spoonful of mashed potatoes, and a little cranberry sauce. She sat on a wooden chair beside the kitchen counter. The chair had always been there, tucked against the wall where Thomas once drank his morning coffee. It was never meant to be part of Thanksgiving dinner. From the dining room, laughter rose suddenly when Olivia told a story about her college roommate. Margaret smiled faintly when she heard her granddaughter's voice. Olivia had always been the warmest presence in the house, the only one who still hugged Margaret twice when she arrived. Emily lifted her glass and began explaining the new seating arrangement to a cousin who had just asked about it. She spoke lightly, almost cheerfully, as if she were describing something practical and thoughtful. Emily said Margaret preferred to sit near the kitchen because it made serving easier. Emily said Margaret liked to keep moving during dinner. Emily said it had always been that way. Margaret listened quietly from her chair. She did not interrupt. She did not correct the story. Instead, she watched small details. The way Emily leaned slightly toward the center of the table when she spoke. The way Daniel avoided looking toward the kitchen. The way the guests accepted the explanation without asking another question. Margaret took a slow bite of turkey. It tasted exactly the way it always had. Perfectly seasoned, tender, warm. She had cooked this same meal for more than 40 years. She knew every step by heart. She also knew something else now. Somewhere between setting the table and lighting the candles, the house had changed. Not the walls, not the furniture, but the quiet balance of respect that had once lived inside it. Margaret finished her small meal slowly. When she stood up to refill the water glasses at the table, Emily barely glanced up. But Olivia did. Their eyes met for just a second across the room. Olivia's expression changed slightly, the way it does when someone finally notices something that should not be happening. Margaret gave her granddaughter a calm, reassuring smile. Then she picked up the pitcher of water and walked back toward the table she had built her entire life around. Margaret moved quietly around the dining room after that, the way someone moves through a place that used to belong to them, but no longer. Feels entirely familiar. She refilled water glasses, collected empty serving spoons, and brought fresh rolls from the kitchen even though no one had asked. The conversation at the table flowed easily without her. Daniel spoke about work. Emily described a new neighborhood restaurant that everyone should try. A cousin laughed loudly at a story about traffic on the interstate. Margaret listened to it all from the edges of the room, her footsteps soft against the hardwood floor Thomas had installed himself nearly 25 years earlier. She remembered the weekend he finished those floors. He had spent 2 full days sanding the wood until the entire house smelled like fresh pine. When the final coat of polish dried, he stood in the doorway of the dining room and said the house would hold a lifetime of family dinners. For many years he had been right. Margaret carried a tray of empty glasses back into the kitchen and rinsed them slowly under warm water. From the sink, she could still hear the voices in the dining room, rising and falling like waves. Occasionally, Emily laughed in that bright, confident way she used when she believed she was impressing people. Margaret dried her hands with a towel and paused beside the counter. The house felt different tonight. Not louder, not colder, just shifted somehow, like furniture that had been quietly moved while she was not looking. She stepped back into the dining room carrying a bowl of fresh green beans. Olivia looked up again the moment Margaret entered the room. The young woman watched her grandmother carefully now, as if she had started noticing the small details others ignored. Margaret placed the bowl on the table and turned to leave, but Olivia spoke before she could reach the kitchen doorway. Olivia asked why Margaret was not sitting with everyone. The question hung in the air for a moment. Daniel looked down at his plate. Emily answered quickly, her voice smooth and calm, saying Margaret preferred to stay close to the kitchen because she liked making sure everything was perfect. Emily said Margaret had always been happiest taking care of the meal. Margaret did not correct her. She simply gave Olivia the same gentle smile as before, the kind of smile that said everything was fine even when it clearly was not. Olivia nodded slowly, but the doubt remained in her expression. Dinner continued after that. Plates emptied. Wine glasses were refilled. Outside the windows, the November sky darkened into early evening and the temperature dropped into the low 40s. The candles burned lower along the center of the table. Margaret returned to her chair near the kitchen once more and folded the towel neatly beside her plate. She watched her family finishing the dinner she had prepared from start to finish. And for the first time that evening, a quiet realization settled firmly in her mind. The dinner table was not the real center of the house anymore. Power had shifted somewhere else. Someone else believed they were in charge now. Margaret sat still for another moment, listening carefully to the room that had once revolved around her traditions. Then she stood up again, calm and composed, already beginning to understand something the others had not yet considered. The house still belonged to her. Margaret cleared the plates slowly after dinner began to fade into that quiet stage where conversation grows softer and people lean back in their chairs. No one stopped her. No one insisted she sit down. The dishes moved from the table to the kitchen in small, careful trips, each one balanced steadily in her hands. The dining room remained warm with candlelight while the kitchen filled with the gentle sound of running water and porcelain touching porcelain. She had washed these same plates after hundreds of family meals over the years. Sunday dinners, Christmas mornings, birthdays. The routine felt familiar, almost comforting, but something inside the rhythm had changed. From the sink, she could still hear Emily speaking confidently about holiday travel plans for the winter. Emily talked about ski resorts and weekend getaways, describing them with the casual certainty of someone who believed the future was already organized. Daniel listened quietly. Occasionally he agreed with a short sentence. Margaret dried a plate with a white kitchen towel and placed it back in the cabinet. The cabinet door creaked slightly, just as it always had. Thomas used to promise he would fix that hinge every year. Somehow he never did. Margaret paused for a moment, her hand resting lightly against the wooden counter. The house held so many small echoes of the past that sometimes it felt like time had layered itself inside the walls. She could still remember the day they bought the property. It had been a bright spring morning almost 40 years earlier. The yard had been nothing more than open grass and a few young maple trees barely taller than Daniel at the time. Thomas stood in the driveway that day and said the place would grow into a real family home. He was right. Over the decades, the trees grew tall enough to shade the porch in summer. The dining room table was replaced once, then replaced again with the long oak table Margaret had chosen 10 years ago, so the whole family could sit together comfortably. Margaret glanced toward the dining room again. Emily had leaned forward in her chair, explaining something about renovations. She spoke as if the house were already part of her future plans. She pointed toward the kitchen doorway and mentioned how the wall could be opened up to create a more modern layout. Some of the guests nodded politely. Daniel said very little. Margaret listened without interrupting. She finished rinsing the last plate and turned off the faucet. The kitchen grew quiet again except for the faint murmur of voices drifting in from the dining room. Margaret folded the towel neatly and placed it beside the sink. Then she walked slowly into the hallway that connected the kitchen to the living room. From there she could see the framed photographs lining the wall. Daniel at 8 years old holding his first baseball glove. Olivia as a toddler sitting on Thomas's shoulders in the backyard. A family portrait taken nearly 15 years ago on the front porch. Margaret studied the pictures for a moment. Every memory inside that house had been built piece by piece through years of work, patience, and sacrifice. She understood something clearly now. Respect inside a family does not disappear all at once. It fades quietly when people begin believing the past no longer matters. Margaret turned back toward the dining room where the candles were burning lower and the conversation continued without her. The house was still warm. The table was still full. But the person who had built the foundation of it all was standing in the hallway, listening carefully and beginning to see the future much more clearly than anyone else in that room. Margaret returned to the dining room a few minutes later carrying a fresh pot of coffee, moving with the same calm patience she had shown all evening. The candles were now shorter, their flames flickering lower as the night outside deepened into a cold November darkness. The large windows reflected the warm light of the room back into itself, turning the dining area into a quiet, glowing space surrounded by shadow. Emily was still speaking confidently about future plans. She had begun describing ideas for updating the house again, explaining how the kitchen wall could be removed and how the dining room could be expanded to create a more open, modern layout. One guest nodded politely. Another sipped wine and listened with mild curiosity. Margaret set the coffee pot gently on the table beside the empty turkey platter. The porcelain touched the wood with a soft sound that caused a few heads to turn briefly in her direction. Emily paused only long enough to smile politely before continuing her explanation, describing new countertops and lighter paint colors. Margaret poured coffee into several cups without interrupting the conversation. She moved carefully around the table, filling each cup the way she had done countless times before. When she reached Olivia, the young woman looked up again with the same quiet concern that had been growing in her expression all evening. Margaret gave her a small, reassuring nod and continued pouring. When the cups were full, Margaret carried the pot back toward the kitchen but stopped just outside the doorway. From that spot, she could hear the conversation clearly without being fully seen. Emily's voice had lowered slightly now, the confident brightness replaced with something more practical. She was speaking directly to Daniel. She mentioned that houses this size required too much maintenance for someone Margaret's age. She said it gently, as if presenting a sensible idea rather than a judgment. She suggested that eventually it might make more sense for Margaret to move somewhere smaller, somewhere easier to manage. She mentioned retirement communities and quiet neighborhoods designed for people who no longer wanted the responsibility of a large home. Daniel answered slowly, choosing his words carefully. He said they could talk about it another time. Emily did not push the subject further, but the meaning of the conversation hung quietly in the air like the final note of a song. Margaret stood still in the hallway for a moment, listening to the room she had spent decades building. She did not feel anger. She did not feel shock. What she felt instead was clarity, the kind of calm understanding that arrives after years of watching people reveal themselves through small choices. Emily believed she was planning the future of the house. Daniel believed the situation would resolve itself quietly over time. The guests believed they were simply witnessing an ordinary holiday dinner. Margaret stepped back into the kitchen and rinsed her hands under warm water. The familiar scent of coffee drifted through the air. Outside, the temperature had fallen into the upper 30s, and frost was beginning to gather along the edges of the lawn. Margaret dried her hands slowly and looked through the kitchen window toward the backyard where the maple trees stood tall and still in the cold night. Those trees had been no taller than a child when she and Thomas first planted them. Now they stretched above the roofline like quiet guardians of the property. Margaret understood something important in that moment. People sometimes forget who built the foundation beneath their plans. They assume the past has already finished its work. She turned off the kitchen light and walked calmly back toward the dining room, her mind steady, her thoughts clear, and a quiet decision beginning to take shape that none of the people sitting around that table had yet imagined. Margaret returned to the dining room with the same calm composure she had carried all evening, but something inside her had shifted quietly into place. The conversation around the table had grown softer now, the way gatherings often do after the main meal is finished and coffee cups begin to replace dinner plates. Emily was describing holiday decorations she planned to buy in December, speaking as if the house were already part of her long-term plans. Daniel listened with polite attention, though he still avoided looking toward the kitchen doorway where Margaret had spent most of the evening. Olivia sat quietly between them, stirring the last of her cranberry sauce with a fork while watching the room with thoughtful eyes. Margaret moved slowly to collect the final empty plates, stacking them carefully in her hands. No one stopped her. No one insisted she sit down. The routine had already been accepted by the room as something natural, something expected. She carried the plates into the kitchen and set them beside the sink. The clock on the wall read a little past 8 in the evening. Outside, the cold November night had settled completely over the neighborhood. The maple trees in the backyard swayed gently in the wind, their branches casting long shadows across the frosted grass. Margaret washed the dishes slowly, letting the warm water run over her hands as she worked. The steady rhythm of washing and drying gave her time to think clearly. She was not thinking about the dinner itself anymore. That moment had already passed. What remained now was the future, and the future required decisions. When the last dish was placed back into the cabinet, Margaret dried her hands and walked toward the small desk near the living room window. The desk had belonged to Thomas for many years. It still held a few of his old fountain pens and a leather notebook that Margaret used to keep track of household expenses. She opened the drawer and looked at the documents inside. Property records, insurance papers, bank statements, everything that defined the quiet structure of the life she and Thomas had built together. Margaret closed the drawer gently and rested her hand on the desk for a moment. In the dining room, Emily's voice rose again in cheerful conversation, explaining how much easier life would be if certain changes were made to the house. Margaret listened carefully, not with anger, not with resentment, only with understanding. Emily believed she was preparing the future. Daniel believed time would settle the situation naturally. The guests believed they were simply finishing a pleasant holiday evening. Margaret stepped away from the desk and walked back toward the kitchen window. The backyard lay silent under the pale glow of the porch light. The tall maple trees stood exactly where they had been planted decades earlier. Their roots ran deep beneath the soil, holding steady through every winter storm that had passed through the town. Margaret understood the meaning of that quiet strength better than anyone else in the house. Some things appear stable because the foundation beneath them is strong. But when the person who built that foundation begins to make new plans, the entire future can change in ways no one expects. Margaret turned off the kitchen light and looked once more toward the dining room, where her family continued talking around the long oak table. A small calm smile touched her face. By morning she would begin putting her decision into motion. The house grew quiet after the guests began leaving. Coats were collected from the hallway closet. Car doors closed softly outside in the cold night air. One by one the headlights disappeared down the street until only a faint silence remained over the neighborhood. Margaret stood near the living room window watching the last car turn the corner at the end of the block. The porch light cast a pale glow across the driveway, and the frost had begun to settle over the lawn. Inside the house the warmth of the evening still lingered, carrying the faint scent of coffee and roasted turkey through the rooms. Daniel stacked a few remaining plates near the sink, while Emily scrolled through her phone, occasionally showing Olivia photographs she had taken during dinner. Their voices were softer now, tired from the long day, but still relaxed. Margaret walked slowly back toward the dining room. The candles had nearly burned down to their bases, leaving small pools of wax along the silver holders. The long oak table looked different now that the chairs were empty. Just a few crumbs remained beside the plates, and several glasses still held a small amount of wine. Margaret began clearing the table quietly, lifting each dish with the same steady care she had shown throughout the evening. Daniel looked up once as she passed him in the kitchen doorway. For a moment it seemed as though he might say something. Perhaps an apology. Perhaps a simple thank you. But the moment passed quickly, and he returned to rinsing the plates. Emily continued speaking about holiday plans, mentioning that they might travel for a few days in December if they could arrange time away from work. Margaret listened without interrupting. She washed the final dishes and placed them neatly in the drying rack. When the kitchen was clean, she turned off the overhead light and walked slowly into the hallway again. The framed photographs along the wall caught the dim glow from a lamp in the living room. Margaret paused beside one photograph in particular. It showed Daniel standing beside Thomas on the front porch many years ago, both of them smiling proudly beside a freshly painted railing. Daniel had been 14 at the time, tall and hopeful, still looking toward his father for guidance. Margaret studied the picture for a moment before continuing down the hallway toward the small desk near the window. The house was completely quiet now except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Margaret opened the drawer and removed a folder containing several documents she had reviewed earlier that evening. She placed the folder on the desk and sat down in the chair Thomas used to occupy every Sunday afternoon while paying the bills. The leather surface of the desk felt cool beneath her hands. Margaret did not rush. She simply opened the folder and looked again at the papers that defined ownership of the property, the accounts, and the future of the estate. For decades those papers had remained unchanged because Margaret believed the path of the family was simple and secure. Tonight had shown her otherwise. She closed the folder gently and returned it to the drawer. Outside the wind moved softly through the tall maple trees in the backyard. Their branches swayed slowly beneath the pale porch light. Margaret stood up from the desk and walked toward the staircase leading to the second floor. Her steps were steady, her mind calm, her decision now fully formed. In the morning she would make a call that would begin changing the direction of everything that had quietly shifted in this house. The next morning arrived quietly, wrapped in the pale gray light of late November. Frost covered the edges of the lawn like a thin sheet of glass, and the tall maple trees in the backyard stood motionless against the cold sky. Margaret was already awake before the sun fully rose. She moved through the kitchen with the calm routine that had guided most of her mornings for decades. Coffee brewed slowly, filling the room with its familiar warm scent. The house felt different now that the voices from the night before had faded. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was steady, thoughtful, almost peaceful. Margaret carried her coffee to the small desk near the living room window and sat down. The leather chair creaked softly beneath her weight, the same quiet sound Thomas used to make every Sunday when he reviewed the household accounts. For a moment she allowed herself to remember those quiet mornings. Thomas reading the newspaper, Daniel rushing through the kitchen as a teenager late for school, Olivia visiting as a child and leaving crayons scattered across the dining room table. The memories did not bring sadness. They brought clarity. Margaret opened the desk drawer and removed the same folder she had studied the night before. Inside were the documents that quietly defined the future of everything in the house. Property ownership, savings accounts, insurance records, the life she and Thomas had built step by step over 40 years. Margaret took a careful sip of coffee and reached for the telephone on the desk. She dialed a number she had not used in several months. The call connected quickly. On the other end of the line was a calm professional voice she knew well. Margaret explained that she wanted to schedule a meeting later that morning. She spoke slowly and clearly, outlining the documents she wanted to review and the changes she intended to make. The voice on the phone agreed without hesitation and offered an appointment at 10:30. Margaret thanked him and placed the receiver back on the cradle. The decision she had formed during the quiet hours of the night now felt firm and simple. She was not reacting in anger. She was preparing for the future in the same practical way she had always handled the responsibilities of the house. Margaret finished her coffee and walked through the dining room. The long oak table had already been cleaned and polished before she went to bed. The candles were gone. The plates were back in the cabinet. Nothing remained of the evening except a faint memory in the air. Margaret paused beside the chair at the head of the table, resting her hand lightly against its back. For years this seat had symbolized the center of the family, the place where Thomas once carved the turkey and where Margaret hosted countless holiday meals. Respect for that place had once been understood without explanation. Now she knew it needed something stronger than tradition. It needed structure. It needed protection. Margaret stepped outside onto the back porch for a moment before leaving the house. The cold morning air was sharp but refreshing. The maple trees stood tall across the yard, their branches reaching toward the pale sky exactly as they had for decades. Their roots ran deep beneath the soil, steady through every season. Margaret looked at them for a moment and smiled faintly. Then she went back inside, collected her coat and keys, and prepared to leave for the meeting that would quietly change the future of the house. Margaret arrived at the law office a few minutes before 10:30 that morning. The building stood on a quiet corner of the small downtown district, a red brick structure that had served the town for more than 50 years. She had visited the office many times before, usually with Thomas sitting beside her as they handled ordinary matters like property taxes or insurance paperwork. Today she entered alone, but her steps were steady and calm. The receptionist greeted her politely and guided her toward a familiar conference room where sunlight filtered through tall windows onto a polished wooden table. Margaret placed her folder on the table and waited patiently until the attorney entered with a warm professional smile. He greeted her by name and asked how he could assist her. Margaret explained that she wished to review the structure of her estate and make several adjustments. Her voice was measured and clear, the way it had been the night before when she realized how the balance inside her home had quietly shifted. The attorney listened carefully while Margaret described the house, the property, and the accounts that she and Thomas had built over 4 decades of careful work. She spoke without bitterness. She simply described the reality she now understood. The attorney nodded thoughtfully and began outlining several options that would allow Margaret to secure the future of the property exactly the way she intended. Margaret reviewed each document slowly, reading every line with the same attention she had always given to the responsibilities of the household. After nearly an hour of discussion, the final arrangement was ready. Margaret signed the updated documents with a steady hand. The house would be placed into a protected trust that ensured its future remained under her control for as long as she lived. After that time, the property would pass directly to Olivia, the one member of the family who had still looked at her with quiet respect across the dinner table. The attorney explained that the structure of the trust also included a clear condition. Anyone who attempted to pressure Margaret into leaving the house or removing her authority over the property would immediately remove themselves from receiving any benefit from the estate. Margaret listened carefully and nodded once. The terms felt fair. Respect, after all, was never a complicated concept. When the paperwork was complete, Margaret thanked the attorney and left the office shortly after noon. The cold air outside felt sharper than it had that morning, but the sky had turned a clear pale blue. She drove home slowly through the quiet streets of the town she had lived in for most of her life. When she turned into the driveway, the maple trees in the backyard stood tall against the winter sunlight, just as they always had. Margaret stepped out of the car and paused for a moment beside the porch. Inside the house, the long oak table waited silently in the dining room. It looked exactly the same as it had the night before, but Margaret knew something had changed beneath the surface of everything. The foundation was now protected. The future was clear. She walked inside, hung her coat beside the door, and moved calmly through the house she had built with patience and care. Somewhere in the coming weeks, the family would gather again for another dinner. When that moment arrived, Margaret would be sitting exactly where she belonged,